Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
On March the 20th, 1959, Ephraim Johnson, a widow of some 12 years, visited my dad to pay for her funeral expenses in advance. Fearing she didn't have much time to live and fearing that her son, Ephraim, didn't have much time either, she also paid for Ephraim's funeral at the same time. Ephraim had been sickly and in a mental hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia for 13 years when his mom paid for his funeral expenses in 1959. He was admitted to Central State Hospital when he was 24 years old. That day, as she was making funeral arrangements, she casually asked my dad if he would be willing to look after Ephraim in case her son outlived her. Daddy told her he would. Ephraim's funeral bill in 1959 was $575.79. Ephraim's was $3 less. Ephraim's bill included a burial dress for $23. Ephraim's bill did not include a burial dress, but did include a trip to Milledgeville to pick him up and bring him back to Reynolds at his death. The charge for that was $3 less than the dress. Ephraim died 4 years later, but Ephraim didn't pass away as quickly as his mom thought he would. Daddy found that Ephraim had been serious about asking him to look after her son. He was named in her will as the person to look after Ephraim. She had been very serious. In 1963, after Ephraim's death, Daddy was appointed Ephraim K Johnson's legal guardian, and he served in that capacity for 31 years. Every Christmas, Daddy would have the ladies who worked at his store make a Christmas package for Ephraim, and they would ship it to Milledgeville. He made sure he had funds in his personal account in the hospital there. The state took care of the tab for people like Ephraim for many years. Daddy managed and invested Ephraim's money, which consisted of a monthly Social Security check. Several years before Daddy died, the state changed that policy, and Ephraim had to start paying his way until the funds were depleted. In 1993, a few months before Daddy died, I drove him to Milledgeville to visit with Ephraim. I found out that day from the staff at Central State that he had not spoken one word since the day he was admitted to that hospital. At that visit, it had been 48 years since he had been a patient at Central State, and it had been at least 48 years since he had spoken a word. Can you imagine being a patient in a hospital for most of your life and not speaking a word to anyone? The day when we visited Ephraim in that hospital, Daddy knew that is Daddy, probably didn't have long to live. On the way home that day, he asked me if I would take over the guardianship. He had made a promise to a widow 34 years earlier. I said I would, and I did for the next 14 years until Ephraim died. I did not see him often. As I mentioned, Ephraim received a check from Social Security every month, and I wrote a check to Central State Hospital on his behalf to pay for his stay each month for 14 years. Every month or two, I got a call or a letter from his caseworker giving me an update on his health or getting permission to do a procedure at the doctor's office. Once a year, I had to complete a host of forms to prove that Ephraim was still eligible for Medicaid. It was not hard to prove for a man who owns nothing and has spent almost his entire life in a mental institution. When I think things are going bad for me, sometimes I think of Ephraim. I haven't got it nearly as bad as I think. Neither do you, by the way, if you are listening to this. When she made her last will and testament, Corrine had no idea that her son would live another 49 years. Sometimes I wonder why God would keep a person like that in that kind of shape for so long. Imagine he was trying to teach the rest of us some important things about living life. I think we can learn much about ourselves from people like Ephraim K Johnson. On Monday, October the 9th, 2006, about 12 years after being appointed his guardian, I got a call from a doctor in the emergency room in the hospital in Milledgeville. He asked me if I was EK's next of kin. Ephraim had suffered a major heart attack. I drove to Milledgeville to visit him. When I arrived, he was alone in a hospital room. He stared at me and never took his eyes off me. I could see the light in his eyes, but he never said anything. I talked to him like he was hearing every word, but I had no idea if he understood. I told him who I was and about his mom asking my dad to look after his affairs many years ago. I also said a prayer for him. I can tell you I had a lump in my throat when I left that hospital that day. About 17 months after I visited with Ephraim in the hospital, he died. He was 85. As I thought about Ephraim's life, I remembered Rick Warren and the question he addressed in his book, The Purpose-Driven Life. The question is a simple one. What on earth am I here for? I considered the answer to that question as I stood and spoke at the open grave of Ephraim that day, as I carried out his mother's wishes and my daddy's wishes to give him a proper burial next to his mother in Mount Olive Cemetery near Reynolds. Only 10 people were in attendance, including my wife, me, and the undertaker in charge. 3 people who looked after him in Milledgeville made this 70-something mile drive to Reynolds for the service: Viola, Zena, and Joyce. A local couple who lived across the street from Corrine and used to drive her to Milledgeville to see her son were there. And there was a distant relative and her friend who was nice enough to drive her to the funeral. I've been to smaller funerals, but I can count them on one hand. But the 10 of us had a special time considering the question, what on earth was EK here for? When you consider his life from our perspective, it was not much. He spent 61 of his 85 years in a mental institution. He had not spoken a word since his tonsils were removed when he was a young boy. He was diagnosed with severe mental retardation at a young age. On the surface, he didn't have much of a life. But when you consider the truth that Rick Warren talks about, that our life is not about us but about God, Ephraim's life may be worth much more than we realize. When considering that God never makes a mistake, you begin to think about God's purposes in Ephraim Johnson's life. Maybe God planted Ephraim here so people like me would be reminded that life is not about how much money we have or the material things we accumulate, but this life may be more about how we treat and care for people who are put in our lives and who cannot care for themselves. Jesus said it himself, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me. That afternoon, as I considered the life of E.K. Johnson, I was reminded of what on earth we are here for. And it is certainly not about you and me. 3 weeks after that graveside service, March the 26th, 2008, I attended a memorial service at Central State Hospital for Ephraim. Although I felt strongly that I had carried out the wishes of both my dad and Ephraim's mother in giving him a proper funeral, I felt compelled to go to that service. I'm glad I did. I've been to a lot of funeral services and memorial services in my life. I thought I'd seen it all, but I'd never been to a service that compared to the one I attended that day. The audience was mainly elderly people who have been lifelong residents of the state mental hospital. To put it lightly, when I stood up to say a few words to this group, I saw one of the saddest sights I've ever seen. I couldn't help but wonder how many of the residents have families that even check on them. I would think that most were put there many years ago when they were young, and now their parents have died. Or maybe some have relatives who have forgotten. I'm sure that was not true for all, but I would bet that was true for most. It was obvious that they were severely mentally handicapped. It was difficult for me to keep my train of thought when trying to communicate with this audience. But as I felt sorry for the residents, I was inspired by the caregivers sitting by their sides. I'm not sure how many patients per caregiver there were, but the ratio was very small. In other words, there were a lot of caregivers. I could not help but think about the special person it takes to spend their days caring for someone who cannot care for themselves. It has to be a calling. I was convinced God did not put these special human beings in that audience on earth for themselves. I felt sure He put them here for us, to allow us to show compassion for people who cannot care for themselves. I'll say it again. Success is not about how much money we make, our position in life, or what we have accumulated. Success is about using our God-given talents to help people God has put in our paths. I saw that as clearly as I've ever seen it that day. It is the highest calling we have.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.